I've read quite a few profiles and interviews of Madeline to prepare for this, and in one of them, she probably thinks I'm stalking her, online, when she was discussing with Geena Davis setting up or taking this role at the institute that Geena set up. Madeline half jokingly asked Geena what she wanted from her and what she wanted from this institute to close the gap in terms of gender equality, and Geena shot back, world domination. Madeline's nodding her head. Not quite there yet, but how should we describe it? As a work in progress, which Madeline will expound upon very shortly. Madeline has had a long career in the media space. She started out as a publicist with ABC News in America. She has worked in digital media, cable TV. Amongst other things, she set up the Hallmark channel in the United States. And when I was living in the States about 8 years ago, switching on to one of the soppy movies in the Hallmark channel was my wife and I's idea of a great date-in night every now and then. And it's still going strong too, I think. Madeline has a very strong challenge facing her, as we all know, but she has made the point that the entertainment industry can change gender equality overnight by, in films, casting a female chief executive, casting a female sports star, casting a female lead. It is that simple, but sadly, in many respects, it is still so hard. Before Madeline speaks, we have a very brief film to show you that really clarifies the challenges facing not just Madeline's Institute, but everybody trying to close that gender gap.
Meet Jane. See Jane. See her? She makes up half the world's population. But you wouldn't know it by watching kids' media. On screen, Jane is outnumbered by a ratio of 3 to 1. When she is there, a lot of time it's purely as eye candy. And girls everywhere are watching. On average, over 7 hours a day. If they see Jane, it's with little to say, few career options, and even fewer aspirations. But we can change. Meet Jane. See Jane? She is half the world's population. She has important things to say. And she can be anything she wants to be. But to empower girls, we need to see Jane. SeeJane.org. If she can see it, she can be it.
From the Geena Davis Institute on Gender and Media, please welcome to the stage Madeline Di Nonno.
We're like a sight gag. It's kind of like when Geena and I are together. She's 6 feet tall. I'm about 5'2.5" and shrinking, according to my bone doctor. So thank you so much for having me here. Of course, I want to thank Mary Cotter with the Equity Foundation. I want to thank Screen Australia. I want to thank Film Victoria for having me. And first of all, I would like to have a round of applause for the 16 men who came today. Gender equality at its heart really means men plus women. So it's really important that we embrace our men and boys and we bring them along with us. And Mary and Michael and I were chatting, and I think there may be a new thing for the Melbourne Press Club called Bring a Bloke. So stay tuned, they'll be announcing that program. So by a show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of, well, I'm sure, have you heard of Geena Davis? Very good, very good. And then have you heard of the Geena Davis Institute on Gender and Media? Great. So for those of you who don't know, as you could see from the video, this work came about as a result of a very personal experience for Geena. She's an Academy Award-winning actor, very accomplished, but it was as a mom, she was really, really surprised when she started watching little kids programming with her daughter, who was 2 at the time, that she didn't see a lot of female presence. And she would have her daughter on her lap, and behind her daughter's head, she started counting the number of female characters. And like any mom, she would turn to her friends and she said, hey, did you notice in that movie there was only one female character? And her friends would say, no, I didn't notice. And then when she'd go on meetings for potential acting jobs, she'd say the same thing. She would say, did you notice it doesn't seem like there's a lot of female presence in our movies and our TV shows? And they would say to her, no, that's been fixed. And in all sincerity, they would name the one female character that was in that TV show or in that movie, and thinking that they had the whole gender covered. And that's when the idea struck her. She thought, wow, no one is taking me seriously. I need this thing called data. And I mean, she's an actor, and she all by herself nearly 10 years ago raised a lot of money and found an academic and conducted the largest study and the first study ever on gender depictions in family films and children's TV shows. And when she found out that truly there is a gender disparity, that's when she thought, all right, well, now what I do? And her thought was, well, I'm in the industry. I know everybody. I'll just take it directly to the industry. So our philosophy has been, if you can change the mind of a child, you can change the world. And we've always felt that media is one of the most powerful industries and means to influence social and cultural behaviors, and particularly when you look at the influence of pop culture globally. But our operating procedure has been maybe a little bit different than what you normally face when you have people writing all these nasty letters to you and to your newspapers and your TV stations. We decided to take a very collaborative approach in that we'll never shame and blame you. We'll never talk about your IP in public. This data that you see, which I'll be sharing with you, is aggregated. If you want to know how you're doing, we'll be happy to give you a report. But that way, if we're having a meeting and you're talking about your company and you're talking about the issues that you're having either with a consumer products division or with a creative department or even fights that are in the writer's room, how could we ever put that out in the press when you've opened your doors to us? So we do not have consumers storm the gates of your buildings. We're more of a B2B than a B2C. And sometimes I think we're Hollywood's best kept secret because unless you give us permission to talk about something that we changed, we kind of can't talk about it. But I will have some examples. So fast forward, 10 years later, we have the largest body of research assembled. And what's been wonderful is that now you have a lot of organizations, a lot of academics, a lot of guilds coming into the media place, looking at gender depictions, looking at pay inequity. You have a lot of actors that feel comfortable talking about it. So there's a lot of dialogue. And being the pioneers that we are, we needed to take it a step forward. So about 2 years ago, we were awarded a $1.2 million grant from Google. And Google said, we think you can do a lot more research, cheaper, deeper, better, using technology. We think computer science can help. Fabulous. So 2 years later, with the help of Google and a fabulous engineer, I just want to, is that on it? Yeah, okay. I want to show his picture. Is that what they're seeing? Yeah, okay. So the dude on the right, Sri Narayan, leads the SAIL laboratory at the University of Southern California School of Engineering. And he's one of the preeminent engineers that deals with face and audio recognition. He's done a lot of work for the government. He's got a really high clearance, apparently. And he's done a lot of work for IBM, a lot of work actually in autism. So we put together this dream team of scientists to come together, which I call to build a thingamajiggy. And you will see a demonstration of that. But what it has allowed us to do is process a lot of moving images, and because it's automated, to be able to really unpack unconscious gender bias in a way that's just not possible with the human eye. So I'm going to take you through some of those findings. And this deck is kind of a mashup of a few different research studies because I wanted to put something exclusive together for you. And you'll also see some new research which actually hasn't been published that we did in collaboration with the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency. They on their own have been conducting a women's index, which is in a huge study looking at all aspects of what concerns women. And we were able to work with them to field some questions on the impact of TV and film on women around the world. And towards the end of the deck, I'll share with you some findings from women in Australia. So without further ado, I'll get through this. So I talked a little bit about the tool. It uses audio and face recognition in order to discern not only gender, but screen and speaking time. And no one in the world can do this just yet. So what I'm going to do is give you an example of speaking time. And before you play that, so the gray section is the male voice, and the peachy coral section is the female voice. So why don't we give that a whirl?
I couldn't do what I do without you. And I've been thinking about doing something special for you, so...
Good gravy, fine. Oh, that's...
You're a crazy cupcake!
So what you can see is that the tool, and we call it GDIQ, which stands for the Geena Davis Inclusion Quotient. You have no idea how many hours were spent coming up with that name with Geena. Anyway, so you can see the green box is for the female and the blue box is for the male. And so now I'm going to show you an example of background characters, because one of the things that we say to storytellers, most storytellers tend to think about the leads, who's really driving the story. And we believe that if it's fiction, you should look at the entirety of the television show or the film or the commercial, the advertising commercial, because there's a lot of opportunities to infuse gender and diversity, not only with the leads, but in the background characters. So this actually, we're just starting to do background characters, but we're going to show you an example of that.
I told my ma.
I want you to be a dental hygienist, a mother working 2 days a week.
Historically, what we have found is that it's around a 3-to-1 ratio of male to female characters in terms of leads. But in the background characters, what we have found is that it's about almost a 5-to-1 ratio, so about a 17%. And this will help us better measure it more accurately to see if there's been some changes in trends. So what we found in this study, so this study that we did was the top 100 movies of 2015. And what we found overall is that male characters had 2 times the amount of screen time as their female counterparts. And when you looked at screen time by lead, that male characters still had 3 times the amount of screen time. So the other thing we looked at is speaking time. Same thing, male characters overall had 2 times more speaking time. And when you looked at it by leads, same thing, male characters had 3 times as much speaking time. So the point is, how is it possible that in the largest movies out of the United States, these are the 100 largest grossing box office movies, that across all of them, the male characters had 2 to 3 times more screen and speaking time? These are different studios, obviously, and you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and as you know, our movies cross your shores, so we're enculturating these messages. And now it begs the question, well, how is that decision being made? Is it being done in the editing room? Is it being done by a second AD when they're shooting? And for anyone who's an actor, you really better count your words in your script, and you better make sure that camera's, pointing at you. So it really starts to unpack what we consider unconscious bias in a way that has not been humanly possible. But what about the business imperative? And what we found out is that in the top 100 films of 2015, female-led films did almost 16% more at the box office. And male and female co-leads did almost 24% more at the box office. So there's always been this myth in America and Hollywood that men won't watch women and that women can't open up a movie. Well, I think after Star Wars, we can dispel that myth, but it's not only the social imperative, because women are 51% of the population, but it's the business imperative. You can make more money. And when we look at the data in America from the Motion Picture Association of America, it's women who are over the age of 25 that are driving box office. We've lost boys 12 to 17 to video gaming and online gaming. So from the standpoint of exhibition, there's a lot of money that can still be made. So one of the things we look at is, okay, that's what's happening on screen, what's happening behind the camera. And this data was conducted by a wonderful researcher out of the other side of USC, Dr. Stacy Smith. And a few years ago, we did our first global study, and we looked at the 10 largest film entities around the world, of course, Australia being one of them, and it's your usual suspects, it's your developed countries. And we wanted to know what's happening behind the camera, and it's about a 4-to-1 ratio across the board. In the US, it's almost a 5-to-1 ratio. So what you have to think about is storytellers create stories that they either know or they love. So think about it. From an authenticity standpoint, if the stories are being driven by men, then it may be likely that you don't have a lot of female presence on screen. And here's a look. It may be hard for you to see that, so I'll call some things out. In terms of directors, writers, and producers across country. Now, what's interesting is, I have to point this out, go to the bottom, and I don't know if you can read this, but look at the percentage of directors in the UK. Now, this was a snapshot from 2014. These were the most popular films coming out of those countries at that time. These numbers could have just shifted dramatically in the last year or two, but look at the percentage of directors. And these are films from the UK, the most successful films, 27.3%. And then look at the US, 0. And in the US, we have never achieved double digits. In Australia, you have. I think it was 16% you've had female directors. The US, never been in the double digits. Now, we had to create an 11th market, US-UK, because there's a US, there's a UK, and there's US-UK collaborations. Look what happens when we start working with the UK. We bring those numbers right to the bottom. So the question is, what happens when the United States starts to do more international deals? Everyone's scrambling for a China deal. Everybody's scrambling for an India deal. What's going to happen to the storytellers behind the scenes? But the good news is, what happens when women are in the driver's seat? So what we found is that across these 10 countries, when there was the presence of a female writer or director, there was a direct correlation of a 6.8 to a 7.5% increase in on-screen roles. And what we found out in the US, similarly, it was about a 10% increase in on-screen roles. So one of the solutions, and clearly Film Victoria, Screen Australia are working on it, is to get more females behind the scenes that then will drive the narrative and the story arcs in front of the camera. So the other thing we look at are careers. We know there's not a lot of female presence, and in many cases they're sexualized, usually 4 to 6 times more as their male counterparts, but we wanted to look at, do they have a job? And this was an analysis across all 10 of the countries. And when you look at these figures across law, academia, medicine, sports, religion, when you look at the column on the far right, you can see that it's almost single digits for females in careers. And we're talking about the highest level of office. So we're talking about presidents, and we're talking about partners and judges, not just your basic doctor, lawyer, which you see. And then the other thing we looked at is STEM. So were you all familiar with the term STEM? So science, technology, engineering, and math. Now in America, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't have a category for STEM, so we kind of jury-rigged it and came up with a way of looking at it, and we broke it down into physical science, which is your doctors, computer science, technology, engineering, math, and other. And clearly, thanks to CSI in the United States, we'll see plenty of forensic scientists. In fact, someone did a study of the crime shows in the United States, which we can thank CBS for, and that because we have shown so many female forensic scientists, although they may be wearing very tailored blouses and Prada shoes, I'd love to see someone running through blood in Prada shoes in a crime scene. But nonetheless, in the United States, the demand for college degrees in forensic science has gone up to 75%. They can't keep up for the demand. But the problem is, particularly in the United States, we know by 2020, there'll be probably about 1 to 2 million jobs that we can't fill because our children aren't pursuing STEM jobs. And when you see a scientist, particularly in American TV, they're kind of nerdy, they're these old, white guys with glasses, and we actually have a children's video where they ask the kids what a scientist looks like, and it's stereotyped to the 1950s. So the future is really showing all kinds of characters. And so ultimately it comes down to, well, so what? Why does it matter? This is just entertainment. It's make-believe. And this is where I wanted to show you some of this new survey data from our friends at J. Walter Thompson. So they started out the Women's Index by surveying about 4,300 women in 9 countries, and it's now gone up to 7,300. And it hasn't been published yet, but I was able to get the permission. And we said, look, we really need to know the impact, because people need to know, why does it matter, particularly when they think, well, entertainment, who cares about entertainment? And so they surveyed, these are women in Australia, and you can see it's millennials, Gen Z, and baby boomers. And we said, how important has it been to you to see a role model? And role model may not be our favorite word, because when you say role model, again, that's a very stereotyped description of the female experience. But for the sake of this, it's their word, they're British, I can't argue with them. Role models. And you could see across, this is very high numbers, 44% for millennials, 42% for Gen Z, and 39% for baby boomers. And then we started to ask them, well, how has it influenced your life? And they said, well, it's helped me to be more assertive and more ambitious. And you can, again, I don't know if you can see this, but for millennials, it's 26%, for Gen Z, 16%, and a little less, for baby boomers. And they said, well, it helped me, I decided to take up a sport. And again, you can see 11% for millennials, 4% for Gen Z, and 2% for baby boomers. And the sport thing is very interesting, because we know from our friends at J. Walter Thompson that women who engage in sport, and since Melbourne is a sport, and I heard the women's went crazy with the ratings when they showed the women's team recently. So the women who play sports or take up a sport are 20% more employable than women who don't take up a sport. So when you think about the economic and business imperative, if media is helping them to engage in a sport, it's important. And actually, a real-world story, how many of you know that Geena qualified for the Olympic trials when we were coming up to the, okay. So how did that happen? Well, she was 6 feet tall as a baby. And so she never wanted to play sports. She always felt really gangly. But she was forced to learn how to play sports through many of her roles. And it was after that she thought, well, I guess I'm kind of coordinated. And she thought maybe I can do a sport the non-Hollywood way. Because when she was doing League of Their Own, the crew wasn't allowing them to throw real baseballs at them. It was really like a spongy ball on a hinge, like a slingshot. So she was watching archery, and she thought, well, that's graceful, and I like that you're measured based on points. And so she called up then the former Olympic coach, and she trained, at the age of 41, she trained for 2.5 years, became 32nd in the country, and qualified. She didn't make it, but she qualified. And what's interesting about that is last year, her former coach called her up and said, I want you to know that girls' participation in archery has skyrocketed, and it charted in 2012. And do you know the movies that came out in 2012? Does anyone want to shout out and guess? That was one, yes. So Brave and Hunger Games came out at the same time. So we approached the American National Association of Archery. We did a survey of all their members of all ages, and 7 out of 10 girls said that it was because of Brave and Hunger Games that they got interested in archery, and girls' participation in archery shot up over 100%. And we always say, if she can see it, she can be it. So it's very important. And last but not least, very important, if you look at the last line, for some of the women, it influenced them to leave an abusive relationship. So they're really, the so what media really does matter. So what do we say to people? Again, we're collaborative. We want you to tell the stories that you're going to tell. And we say, make whatever you're going to make. But go through the script. I'm sure all of your companies have had diversity programs, probably for 20 years. But gender has not been on the agenda, which is definitely the title and theme for the Equity Summit in Melbourne. But in thinking about not only which characters can be changed from, say, African American or Asian, but also could it be female? And we know that many storytellers are really focused on the leads, but we say if there's a crowd scene right in the script, a crowd gathers that is 50% female. Otherwise, the default will be male. And I'll tell you another Geena story. So how many of you remember the movies Stuart Little? So she was waiting to go on set, and she was watching the second AD set up the scene. And they were taking a little boy, and they were giving him a remote, and it was these boats, remote control boats, taking a little boy, putting the girl behind him, taking a little boy, putting the girl behind him. And she said, hey, do you think you can give half the girls the remotes? And he looked at her, duh, of course. And it wasn't an evil conspiracy against women. It was just they didn't really think about it. And in America, I don't know what the numbers are in Australia, but 80% of the casting directors are female. So again, unconscious gender bias works for men and women. It's not necessarily this evil conspiracy that everyone thinks we have. So people say, well, are you successful? And we are. And like I mentioned earlier, we can't always talk about specific examples, but we did do a survey of a few thousand entertainment industry executives that have either heard Geena speak or have heard us present. And we said, whenever we do these surveys, you always say over 90%, you're going to share the data, you're going to use it. But have you actually changed anything? And 68% said, yes, I've changed 2 projects. And 41% said, yes, I've changed 4 more projects. And we said, well, what exactly did you do? They said, well, I made the female character less sexualized, put some clothes on them. I hired some female crew. I took some non-speaking characters and gave them some dialogue. And I actually gave them a job. And some real-world examples of that. A few years ago, and there's been a few sequels since then, I don't know how many of you have little kids who've heard of a movie that came out from Sony Animation called Hotel Transylvania. So at the time, the head of the studio was Michelle Ramos-Chiate, and the producer was Michelle Madraca, and they were halfway through the movie. Now, you know it takes 3 to 5 years for an animated film to come out. And they were a third of the way through, and she thought, oh, goodness, what could we do? And in the movie, there's a lot of flying witches on brooms. So she tripled up the witches to put more female presence in the background, and she actually took one of the non-speaking characters and gave them some dialogue with Dracula, and that's one of the things she did. Another example is, have any of you watched an American TV show called Empire, which is on Fox? So season 2, one of the writers, she's now a showrunner, but one of the writers is a woman named Wendy Calhoun. And she heard Geena speak on a panel, and that season they were kicking around an idea for a venture capitalist. And in the writer's room, they called him Rich T. White Guy. And Wendy thought, I wonder if that could be a female. So like any good writer who usually grounds the story in some sense of reality, she went out and found binders full of female venture capitalists. And when she went back into the writer's room, when she pitched it, no one could really contest it. And that character was played by, does anyone want to guess? Marissa Tomei for season 2. Another example is with The Little Prince. How many of you have seen the new version of The Little Prince? It was directed by Mark Osborne, and he said, hey, I'm about to go to Paris for 4 years to make this movie, and I want you to know I'm going to add major female characters. And Geena and I were saying to ourselves, how is that possible? You can't mess with The Little Prince. And lo and behold, what he did is he kept the classic story of the little boy and the relationship that he had the same, but he wrapped it around in a storyline of a single working mom and her daughter, and how the daughter discovers the story about this little boy. So that's just an example of some of the change. And we say that of all the business categories that exist in the world, it may be very hard to get 50% of the corporate boards to be female, or 50% gender parity in terms of law, academia, or even politics. But we're media. It's fiction. We can do whatever we want. Let us paint a picture of the world the way we want it, and then let life imitate art. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Madeline. On behalf of the 15 other blokes here as well, I thought that was terrific, and some really good messages. Now, Madeline has quite graciously agreed to take questions from the floor, so please don't be shy. We'll start with my colleague, Karen Percy, another journalist down here. There is a roving microphone, David, on the table over here, so please put your hand up, and if you can say who you are, and if you're with an organisation, who you're with, that'd be appreciated as well. Karen.
I thought that was a wonderful speech. Thank you so much. A real eye-opener, I think, into a lot of what a lot of us are thinking and seeing. I'm wondering what the non-election of a female president means for gender issues in America more generally.
Regardless of your politics, for us, the need to see female presence and to inspire not only our girls but our boys to respect and appreciate diverse female voices is more important than ever. So for us, it's march on, move on, and keep the work going. And again, regardless of politics, when you talk about inspiration for your children, no matter what your politics are, Everyone wants their children to flourish. And that's our position on that.
As an old white man with glasses, can I ask you, do you think that the sexual discrimination that you're talking about is learned, is it inherited, or is it obtained by men as they get older?
That's a really great question. And for example, I'll tell you a story. So Dora the Explorer, which is a fabulous show from Nickelodeon, which I'm more familiar with than your fabulous kids shows at ABC, but the Consumer Products Group wanted to do a Dora backpack because they know, as most of you probably know, that the viewership, even for a lot of popular female-driven preschool or kids shows, it's 50% boys. So they thought, fabulous, we'll do a Dora the Explorer backpack for boys. And it was this deep magenta purple. The parents wouldn't buy it for their sons. So that's a parental imprint. So you have a parental imprint, you have an educational imprint. So if teachers don't call on girls, they only call on boys. So there's a lot of gender biases in a lot of different aspects. We can control media. We can control media messaging. We can control advertising messaging. And the advertising industry is very, very keen on this. And in the United States and also globally, really taking a hard look at it as well. So that's where we can have control. I'll tell you another story. I was in Indianapolis and speaking, and I had someone from the Charles Schwab company, come up to me and say, I'm a regional vice president, and we've been trying to recruit women for the retail side of our business. We can't get them to apply for the job. Why is that? And I said, well, go home tonight and look at your corporate website. How are you messaging to women? What are the imagery? Are you showing diverse images of women throughout your website? Is it a bunch of, no offense, old white guys? And you're not old, but I'm just saying. So, and how are you describing the job? Because one of the things we've learned from Harvard and Stanford is that women tend to check off every single box. Whereas men will say, I have one of those, I'll just go for it. Lots of times women have to be asked. And to me, that gets back to this role model, be polite, don't be loud, and I think that all rolls up into it. And so by the time I got back to Los Angeles, I had a message, and she said, oh my God, our website is terrible, I'm on the phone with the IT people. And so again, sometimes you don't realize the messaging and how those messages are subliminal, and it kind of bakes in to our unconscious.
Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Leader from Cause Chambers Westgarth Lawyers and the Melbourne Press Club Board. Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm glad you were talking about age, because I wanted to ask you a question about gender equality and age equality. Age equality.
Wait. Gender equality?
Gender equality and ageism.
Ageism,
Yeah.
okay.
Do women in Hollywood still have to lie about their age?
Well, one of the things we found out in that global study was that women and girls aged 13 to 39 had the same percentage of sexualization across all 10 countries. Beyond 39, you don't even have females, so who cares? I mean, it's just, we don't even bother to go there. And so ageism is a really big problem. And when we looked at the percentage of female characters for women over 39, it just drops off. And then the age difference between men and women, it's like the men get older, and this is the female characters, and the women get younger. And so that gap keeps getting more and more and more. So it's definitely a big problem. Not only on screen, but also behind the scenes as well. So it affects writers. It has and also executives as well.
Okay, we'll go to Jim, then Veronica.
Jim Clark. I'm sorry to make this male-dominated question time. However, women have been oppressed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and although many people would like to have seen the progress be more rapid than what it has recently, it seems to me that progress is pretty quick, and before too far in the future, equality will be achieved. But what happens then? When equality has been achieved, will the evolution continue, and will we see a time, sometime in the future, where the current situation is reversed and it's the males who are oppressed and the women are dominating, which I think would be a good thing?
Well, I'm not a futurist, and I'm sure there are scientists who have opinion on that, but it's about relevancy. And when you look at the population of women being, 51%, will it always be that way? Will it decline? I don't know. But I think as media and storytellers, it's important that we stay relevant. And one example of relevancy is we know that families, diverse families, like to see TV programs with diverse families. They like to see advertising that is relevant to them. And we know from the advertising industry is that when an advertiser has diverse advertising placed next to appropriately diverse TV programming, they sell more stuff. So to me, it's really about relevancy. We know in the United States by the year 2020, Caucasians will be in the minority for children 18 and under, period. So media, to me, has to stay, relevant to how the population changes.
Veronica.
Thanks. Veronica Scott, Minter Ellison, and the board of Melbourne Press Club. There's a lot of debate about quotas, and the Victorian government here, for example, is really working hard to introduce quotas. It's caused a lot of debate, and there's a lot of views for and against it. What are your views about quotas and the impact, negative or positive, on trying to achieve that?
It's very interesting, in my humble opinion, and I was talking about this at our table, from what I've gleaned, there's probably only 7 countries that of the countries that have government funding for TV and film, I'm only aware of 7 that are doing something. You have the BFI, which rolled out their program in 2014 called the 3 Ticks. You have what you're doing in multiple parts of your country. You have Sweden, you have New Zealand, you have Ireland, and then a week ago, my colleagues in India told me that the Indian government just announced a program that if you're a female filmmaker and you want to enter your film in international film festivals, that the Indian government will pay your fees and pay your travel. So there's a big difference between the US and international. We don't have government funding in the US. So we're learning and watching what's happening internationally. And I think it's respectable and reasonable that if you are a government-funded body, to think about how you appropriate those funds to make sure that everyone has a fair share, that the movies or the TV shows have gender and diversity. I think if you're a private organization or publicly trained, or publicly funded stockholders, that if you're private, if you're capital, I think it's hard to infuse those kind of quotas from a government standpoint. I think it's the right thing to do to examine it, and it may not be a quota, but I know for a fact many American studios and networks have a policy where if you submit a script that's not diverse or 50% female, they may not greenlight the show, and they're going to throw it right back at you. Now, are you reading about it? No, because they can't talk about it. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier, how we don't shame and blame, because we know for a fact there's a lot of great things that you're doing in your companies that you may not be able to go public with. And when you have academics and organizations calling you out and doing these report cards, you're left defenseless because you can't defend yourself. So I do think there's an opportunity for allocation in terms of what is the percentage of female presence behind the camera, what's the percentage of diversity, how are you going to give your funds. The one thing I can say about America is New York City is the largest municipality in the United States. And Mayor de Blasio and the New York Film Commission just set forth a $5 million program similar to what's happening here to allow for finishing grants, and they're funding some script writing contests. And it's very interesting because there's no other state government in the United States that's doing that. So we're really tracking what they're doing because that could be an opportunity in the United States to take it state by state if they do have state-funded programming. So I think it's interesting to see how everyone does and to keep track of the progress and come up with what could be the best practices.
We've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. There's one at the front of the room, and while the microphone goes up, Madeline, it's great. That was a great comment about scripts, the informal vetoing of scripts that aren't diverse enough. How many of the studios are either run by women in Hollywood or have women in roles where they have the power to commission films and not? And do you see that situation changing anytime soon?
Well, in the media sector, you do have more women at the C level versus corporate boards versus some other industries. And they have to run the companies. Some of them are driven by, EBITDA, and stakeholders. So I think they have to look at, their portfolio, of films. But we do know and when you look at the slates that are coming out, now that you have tracking in terms of box office, I think it's easier, to greenlight. Now, from a business perspective, and the world is changing, theatrical exhibition is changing, it's the golden age of TV and digital platforms. They have to weigh out what's ultimately the investment. So if there's a film or a TV show that's coming out of the United States, how is it going to play around the world? And I think they have to juggle that. Plus, I think you've also noticed in the United States, whereas American movie studios, some of them used to do 20, 25 films a year. Not anymore. You've seen a lot of them cut down to 10 to 15 films. But when you look at Star Wars, largest film of all time, extremely diverse, and you hope that that can be an ongoing trend, a reality, not a trend.
We hope so. Over here.
Hi. Oh, God, that's loud. I think it's interesting that your policy is don't blame and shame. That's a great way to keep people on side, being more persuasive and not getting in people's face. But what do you think the balance is to actually help real change what's the catalyst to help real change happen on a more aggressive level between being a good girl and being persuasive and not getting in anyone's face or up anyone's nose and, explaining everything in a friendly way, as you've just said that you do, and it clearly works for you given by your statistical results, and being more militant and saying, actually, we're sick of being a good girl, we're demanding what should have happened a long time ago, and we don't care if you think that's kind of ugly, to speak in a more forthright and strident tone. What's the balance?
Well, we have approached it by using data and the facts. Because if we're going to sit in front of the CEO of a major studio or a network or production company, we better have the facts and the data so that we can present the information and engage in a dialogue in a very neutral fashion. So that has been greatly appreciated. And also, as you all know, there's so many things that you can't do. Don't show kids eating candy. Don't show kids having salty snacks. Don't show smoking. Don't do this, don't do that. So there's so many mandates that you all have as storytellers and as broadcasters and film companies that we felt taking this approach would be welcomed, which it is, but yet we use the data to begin this cycle of work. So when we come out with a new study like this new tool, it starts the cycle of us meeting with all the major film companies, all the major TV companies, the major production companies, tracking their progress, and then when we have new data, we're going to publish 2016 in January, coming back to them again and again, because as adults, it's that reinforcement over and over and over again. And that's where the persistence that you were saying has to happen, is just constantly coming back, constantly coming back. So it's very laborious for us. There's not push a button. It's really quite laborious, because there's decisions that get made above and below the line. A lot of it is below the line. But it's really been, as you would know in TV, reach and frequency, just reaching as many people over and over and over again. That's why advertisers will spend bazillions of dollars running the same spot over and over and over and over again, because in order to break through that frequency, they have to play that TV spot millions of times before consumers will actually remember it. It's kind of the same thing with us.
And time for one final question, if anybody has a final question. Yes. Just switch it on.
Madeline, thanks very much for coming. It's fantastic to hear you and learn about what Geena's been up to. I've got a couple of questions. One, you said that Geena went out and got squillions of dollars for data development. We've got a very different philanthropic culture here to what exists in the States, but I'm just wondering where she got the dough from.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Who?
You said Geena went out and got squillions of dollars to fund research.
She did. She raised the money privately.
Through what? Through philanthropic organisations?
Initially, it was friends. And then Wallace Annenberg gave her $1.5 million to really launch the Institute out of her personal foundation. Geena's great at selling. And so it's mostly been large philanthropic organizations that can write a 7-figure check. Because as you know, the business model of philanthropy, which goes back hundreds of years, most of the money goes to direct services, and we don't do direct services. And as much as everyone loves research, no one wants to pay for it, which is why most nonprofits do service and don't do research. So it's extremely difficult for us to raise funds.
Okay, thanks for that. And also, the room here is full of news journalists in all different media throughout Victoria. What would be your learnings from the film industry that these people could take away and start implementing in their news organisations? Where do they begin with this stuff?
Well, what was interesting is we've partnered with Bloomberg Media, and they were one of the few media organizations out of the U.S. that mandated that 50% of their editorial have female presence, female stories. And so we thought that was fabulous. So it's one thing to have females reporting the news, but I think it's good to look at what's the percentage of stories. How are diverse women's stories being told? Regardless, I think it's fabulous. Let the men report the news, but what are they talking about? So that's where I think you can really look at it in terms of our weekly, nightly, daily, hourly, whether it's broadcast, online, however you're getting it out there, print, what percentage of the stories are about female stories. And I think that's something you can all measure yourselves.